Good morning. Okay, I think the 9 was a little bit louder than you. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, okay, you got to wake me up. All right. I have kind of a tall order to talk about today, and it was interesting. I had this conversation with a good friend of mine years ago. He got his doctorate in theology at Cambridge, and we were both saying that, I'm going to talk about today, life is about relationships, relationship with God and relationship with others. We'll talk about what it means to lead a healthy life. And one of the most important relationships that we'll ever have is a parenting relationship. And we were talking about the idea, why isn't there Paul's letter to parents, right? You would think there'd be Paul's letter to parents. But the reality is the entire Bible is God's book on parenting, right? How God parents us as his creation. And you don't have to get very far to realize that, and you guys talked about this last week, I think a couple of the parents who were sharing last week, was talking about we don't parent our children the same. And God doesn't parent all of his creation the same. And you also see throughout it that God is incredibly gracious and merciful, and learning about God's grace is a core about parenting. So there's 3 things that I want to do today. One is really gigantic. I'm going to help you guys understand the meaning of life, or what it means to lead a healthy life. I should be able to do that in about 5 minutes, the meaning of life. And every time anybody ever asks me to come speak, whether it's, as a professor or otherwise, I'm just going to tell you already, I'm going to answer some questions, but you're going to leave with more questions than answers. And I just hope that you'll have maybe some different questions or better questions that you're wrestling with in your relationship with Jesus. And then the last part is I just want you guys to have resources, and I'm always available, and the people that work with me are always available as a resource in our community to help people, and especially parents as they're dealing with issues of mental health with their kids and thinking about these issues. So there are often 2 questions that I ask a lot of people who come to see me, the people that work for me, my students. I'm a big unintended consequences person, so I'll often ask, okay, so what are the unintended consequences if we go down that path? What are the things we haven't thought about? Let's think about those things. And then the other question I ask a lot, because people come to me and they're like, hey, Matt, I'm thinking we should do X, Y, or Z. And I go, that sounds like a solution in search of a problem, right? Help me understand the problem you're trying to solve, and then we can talk about whether that's a good solution toward it. And often when I look at people's solutions for things, sometimes people tell me what their problems are, and other times I look at their solutions, and that gives me an indication of what they see as being the problem. So I said this earlier, I hope I don't offend too many people, but I've been thinking a lot recently about advances in communion technology. I know, I sound like a really fun person, right? I spend my time thinking about communion technology, but I was raised Catholic. And so when I was in the Catholic Church, you go up and you receive communion. And then as I've been in the Protestant Church for the last, 30 some years, I've seen communion change, right? From where sometimes you would go up, and then there was for the longest time, there was the crackers that didn't taste very good that you would pass. And then came the really scary time when they would pass this big tray of juice. And you're like, how many of you go I just hope I don't drop the whole tray, right? Okay? I'm supposed to be thinking about the blood of Christ. I'm just thinking I don't want to drop the blood of Christ all over the floor here at church and make a big mess, right? So once I got my juice, then I could take a deep breath and focus back on Jesus. But now I've noticed the most recent advancement in communion technology is this little prepackaged thing. And again, if you use it here, I'm not judging anybody. I'm just asking some questions. And it's this little prepackaged thing, and it's kind of interesting. It's a marvel of technology. Not since Lunchables have we had this kind of increase in food technology. But you peel back the one, and there's this thing that I guess is a cracker. I don't know. It might be edible. I'm not sure. And then you do that, and then you peel the other, and the juice is underneath it, right? Okay. So I look at that and I go, that's really ingenious, but what's the problem that is trying to solve? Some engineer was creating these little communion packets, and so the essence of tragedy is making today's decision based on yesterday's, not based on a foundation. So I'm going to make an argument that we've gotten a little far from what Jesus was talking about in terms of communion, which is really intended to be a meal. And you were supposed to share with one another. Now, my church a while back decided, and this is when I started thinking about this, they decided to do communion differently. They should have talked to somebody like me who was raised Catholic, because the way they did it was they had everybody come up to receive communion. But you ever been to a wedding when they announce that the buffet is open and everybody can go, right? I've seen better organized riots. I mean, there were people like all over the place. You couldn't get to, it took forever to get communion. But when I look at that little packet, I go, okay, what's the problem they're trying to solve? What I've concluded is, how can we deliver communion as quickly as possible, with as little mess as possible, and also account for like fear of germs, right? But it's kind of gotten a little further away from what I think communion is really designed to be. So when you look at solutions, and by the way, I don't know, the engineer, they have to be told what the purpose is, right? Like, what's the purpose of communion? Or they're just saying, okay, I can do this in this way if this is what you want. So when I look at solutions, I think about this is what they value or how they see the problem. I hope I'm not too offensive about that, although these are the kinds of things I think about. So when I look at how people live their lives, I often go, okay, well, that's how they are determining what a healthy life looks like, right? This is how they're living their lives. This is giving me an indication as to what they think health looks like. And I know that this is going to be an oversimplification, but when I think about what does a healthy life actually look like, I come to a couple of conclusions. It's deeper than this, but life is about relationship. Life is about relationship with God and relationship with others. In fact, Jesus was asked, and Jesus said that the main commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And in my field of psychology, and we're going to talk about this even in the question and answer, we look at, okay, so how do we view mental health? Well, we can often view what mental health is based on how we are trying to solve problems of mental health. So for example, in society, and I'm going to talk about anxiety because that just one issue, because there's a lot of anxiety in the world. But first of all, what is anxiety? Well, anxiety on one level is the price we pay as humans for being able to imagine the future, right? When we imagine the future, like dogs don't imagine the future, we imagine the future. And so anxiety at times is the price we pay from being able to imagine the future. Anxiety is different from fear. Fear is a response to a direct threat, right? There's a bear, right, who wants to kill you, right? That's fear. Anxiety is a response to a possible negative outcome ahead, right? And often when people really struggle with anxiety, they confuse the possible with the probable, right? The difference between possible and probable. But when we think about kind of how we deal with anxiety or the increase in anxiety, there's a couple of questions that we ask ourselves that kind of feed into what level of worry or anxiety we might have. The one is an evaluation of the situation itself. What am I facing? And within that, there's two other questions. What am I facing? How dangerous do I think it is? And how important do I think it is? How dangerous do I think it is, and how important do I think it is, right? So if something's really important to you, right, you're going to have some tension about that potentially because there's a cost. You're imagining the future. If this doesn't work out, then what? What will happen if this doesn't work out? And then the second question really is, can I handle it? So that's really about this word that gets used a lot in our society called resilience, right? Do I have the ability to face whatever it is that I'm facing? And I think we have a problem in both sides in our society. And I'm going to talk about how society or the mental health field sees the solution to it, which I don't fully agree with. So I think we are seeing the world as far more dangerous than it used to be. The reality is it's actually a lot safer than it used to be. The world is a lot safer. I've read lots of books about turn of the 19th century New York. You wouldn't want to live there. Hot and cold running feces in the streets, urine, sex trafficking of minors, child labor problems. Like, you wouldn't want to go, oh, well, the good old days. Yeah, let's go back to the good old days of feces in the street. That doesn't sound, I know it's a Sunday morning, I'm sorry I'm bringing up that, but that doesn't sound like the good old days to me. And actually, several years ago, somebody wrote this book where basically said, we need to let our kids play more. Like, we are so afraid of bad things happening that we don't let our kids play. And actually, it was kind of ironic that Matt Lauer was the one interviewing them, because Matt Lauer wasn't the greatest guy in the world. But he took out his phone and he said, well, wait a minute, you're saying the world isn't that unsafe. I have this app on my phone that has red dots on it in my neighborhood where there are registered sex offenders. And you're telling me the world is safer now than it used to be. And she said, well, there were sex offenders 30 years ago. You just didn't have an app on your phone that showed you where they were, right? So the world is actually safer. The problem in our world is we're going to talk about social media. You know, we've shrunken the world where a news story in Seattle, Washington is like covered here, where we never would have known about it before. So, and the news doesn't cover great things, right? They cover all the terrible things that happen. So then we start to think that the world is much more terrible than it used to be. Then we are, through lots of means, diminishing the resilience that we have in terms of dealing with things. So I'll give you two quick examples. One, you know, how do we develop resilience? Well, when my dad passed away, I didn't have a template. He passed away about 10 years ago. I didn't have a template to deal with the loss of my father. But I had experienced other losses. I had lost grandparents. My parents divorced. That was a loss. I had experienced loss of friends. And so while this was the most significant loss I have ever experienced in my life, I had some template to address it. It was still harder than anything else, but I kind of knew I got through that. So the chances are I can probably get through this. You know, with love, with community, I can get through this. So unfortunately, what we're doing in our society with our children is that we're not helping them develop resilience. And I'm not saying, you know, throw your kid in the pool until he can swim. I'm not sure that's the best idea. But, for example, when we have cell phones, most of us use our cell phones to avoid interactions with humans, right? Humans are threatening. I can't talk to them, right? So you get on the elevator and you look at your cell phone, almost just instinctively. You're not even looking at anything. How many of you have been in the elevator and just stared at your cell phone and it wasn't even on? I've done it. Okay, now, for the most part, I'm the guy that when I get on an elevator, especially a crowded elevator, I'm going to say, like, does this look infected to you? Right? I'm that guy. So you don't want to be in a crowd with me. I was in a crowded elevator with a buddy of mine, and he kind of knew. He's like just waiting for me to do something stupid. And I said, yeah. I said loudly enough for people to hear. You know, I just got back from Africa 2 weeks ago. My eyes have been bleeding a little bit. Is that something I should be worried about? You know, and like now people are like backing away from me on the elevator. Okay, but if you're walking down the hallway at work or at school and you can't make eye contact and say hello to somebody, and you're looking at your phone to cope with that, how are you going to cope with anything that's difficult? Right? Learning how to say hello to people, it's an art that is lost. Okay, so what we're doing is we're reducing people's ability to deal with different things in life. However, and we'll talk about this in our question and answer too, society views mental health, and I'm going to break it down for you, as a reduction of negative symptoms. If we reduce the negative symptoms of anxiety, then this person is okay. And I think we just kind of know innately that's not true. All right, just the reduction of negative symptoms is not true. If you have a broken leg, and one of the symptoms of a broken leg is pain, and I give you painkillers and it reduces your pain, is that a sign of health? No. Right? It's healing the broken leg. It's bringing the broken leg to its ideal place of function. So when we look at these types of issues, we want to look at, like, are solutions to things, and they're connected to kind of how we see the problem. And often we think about the idea, and you hear this a lot, that direction determines destination. So if you're driving your car and you don't know where you're going somewhere. Your direction that you're driving is going to take you to a destination. And that's where a lot of us live. And that's why I'm going to create some anxiety for some of you today, because I'm going to ask you to ask some hard questions about how you're living, what you think about your relationship with Jesus. What do you think about what does how you're living say about how you view what a healthy life looks like for yourself and for your children? And what I really want us to get to is where we have a destination that we're heading toward, right? And then that determines our direction. Does that make sense? Most of us don't just get in the car and drive on vacation. We have some place we're going, and we plan to go there. So this isn't an all-encompassing question, but there's a question I ask parents a lot, like, hey, what kind of 30-year-old do you want your son to be? Right? Like, let's start thinking down the road. What are the qualities of a person that you would want them to have? So in Scripture, we talk about that as being the putting off and the putting on. So we're going to put off just driving and not having a destination in mind. And we're going to put on really thinking through and having a destination and how that changes the direction that we go. And so a lot of times when I talk to people, so for example, I played baseball in college, my son played baseball. There was this dad who, his son was a pretty good baseball player, but he was kind of an arrogant jerk. Okay, his son was. Now, he came about it honestly. His dad was the same, except without being a good baseball player. Okay, so now, baseball, and I know it's early, it's Sunday, it's math. We're gonna do math equations, right? All right, you have baseball plus arrogant jerk, right? Okay, now, at some point, baseball ends for all of us. For me, it ended in college. For some people, it ends in the pros. For some people, it ends after Little League. So if you have baseball plus arrogant jerk and you subtract baseball, what's left? Okay, we know what's left. So what are you valuing by how you're doing that? Oftentimes, I'll have people say to me, like, they're worried about their kids. And I get these, by the way, when I say these things, none of these are bad things. You know, my son needs to do well in school. Why? Well, because he needs to go to a good college. Why? Because he needs to get a job, good job. Why? So he can make money. Why? So he can be attractive to somebody of the opposite sex. Why? So he can get married. Why? So he can get a house. Why? So they can have a place for children. All right, you see where I'm going with this. Those are all, there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but they're all focused on the right here, right now, this life. Okay? And you know, I'm a bearer of lots of bad news today. All right, so unless Jesus comes, we all end up at the same place, in a pine box at some point. We all do. So if the goal is just to get through this life as comfortably as possible, then that sounds like a plan, what they just gave me. But is that really what life is about? And I think we would say, no, that's not entirely what life is about. All right? And unless we purpose to be different, we're going to follow the path of society. And that's kind of what society says. They're living, in a sense, living as if there is no God. And so what I like about the fact that you guys are even asking these questions as a church, like I said, I often see what people value by what they do, but also the kinds of questions they ask. And if you're saying, like, what does it mean to be a good parent? Like, how do I deal with this? Those are fantastic questions to think about. But a lot of times, like I said, if we go society's route, we're going down a route where society sees the role of a parent, especially because society says that the world is incredibly unsafe. So the role of a parent is to, you've probably heard this, to provide and protect. Like, the role of a parent is to provide and protect. And somebody shared this last weekend in the talk, where, okay, if all I do is provide and protect for my children, what happens when they leave the house? Have I prepared them to survive, to function, right? So I would say actually that the role of a parent is not to provide and protect. That's a part of a role of a parent. But really, the parent-child relationship is a discipleship relationship. That parenting has a lot more to do with discipleship than it does with providing and protecting. And when we think about discipling, we think about, well, age-appropriate discipling, like we're going to appropriately disciple somebody depending on what developmental stage they're in and how they can handle things. But when you think about being somebody being your disciple, you live life with them. You're certainly more honest about and genuine about your struggles with them than you would be if you were like, so for example, if your role is to provide and protect, you might think, well, if I tell my son that I have things that I worry about, or that I'm not good at something, or I struggle with something, was that going to make him feel safe? Sometimes no, but it's also might be true, right? How have you managed to deal with those things? So when you focus on parenting as really being more discipleship than providing and protecting, you're in a much better place. I'll give you one quick example. I worked with when we talk about unintended consequences, I worked with this client who was in college, and his mom had written all of his papers since he was in 5th grade. All of his papers since he was in 5th grade, including college. She was writing his college papers. And he told me a story where he had this awareness, even in 5th grade. He got an award for one of his papers. And he was standing up in front of the class getting this award, and he felt like a fraud. That's an unintended consequence. He did well in school because his mom wrote all the papers. But what did he learn? Well, he learned that he was incapable of doing well in school on his own, right? So that's the unintended consequence, that he really didn't even feel prepared for life at all. So that's kind of where you think, okay, what problem was the mom solving? Well, he needed to do well in school. Like that was the problem that she was solving. And by the way, I don't think that doing well in school is a bad thing. That's a good thing. I did well in school in high school. But see, doing well in school is not a great goal for our kids, because I did well in school and I never studied. I used to write papers the morning they were due. 5 in the morning, I'd be up writing a paper. And I did well. Now, when I got to college, the first day I was at college, the president of the university said, all of you were in the top 5% of your high school class. Half of you will be in the bottom half of this class. And I was like, uh-oh, right? I had no idea how to study. But worse than that, worse than not doing well in my first semester of college, what I didn't learn, which is what I needed to learn, was that my intelligence, for what it is, it's not that great, my intelligence is a gift from God. And a gift from God is meant to be used to its fullest, to glorify God, not to glorify myself, to glorify God. What was I using my intelligence for? Just get by. And my parents were happy. They were happy with me just getting by. That's not a great goal, right? When you think about that. So I'm going to read a couple passages, maybe only one. And I want to go into a little bit about like the questions that Jesus asked. I want to focus on the questions that Jesus asked. And first of all, when you know and come to terms with the fact that Jesus is God, right, then everything he does has meaning because he could do anything. So when you read scripture and you focus on the questions that Jesus asked and why he did what he did, you kind of go, okay, everything has meaning, from touching the leper, right, to calling attention to the woman who had been healed, who had been bleeding. They all have meaning. So I want to read you a passage about Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10. It says, and they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, Jesus, and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up. He is calling to you. You know, what's interesting about this is that, Bartimaeus was an outcast, struggling daily for his needs, begging for his needs. But he also probably had a lot of time to think about his needs. So in those situations, imagine, I think about high school students when, Somebody tells you to be quiet, and we just don't want to upset anybody, and so we don't. No, Bartimaeus was willing to be bold and call attention to himself, even at the face of ridicule. But then it says here, and throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" A great question, right? Now, Jesus is asking questions not like we ask questions. We ask questions often because we need information and we don't know. Jesus knew the answer to the question that he was asking. So why was he asking it? It was for Bartimaeus' sake, not for Jesus' sake. But the answer to that question, and by the way, it's really interesting, Jesus very rarely did anything against anybody's will. But the answer to that question depends on two things. Who does Bartimaeus think Jesus is? And what does he see as his deepest need? And so Bartimaeus says, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Now here's Bartimaeus, an outcast. Imagine if Jesus was not the Son of God. Imagine the ridicule that Bartimaeus was setting himself up for, to ask somebody to heal his sight who could not deliver that. He had to believe that Jesus was somebody that could deliver that. Otherwise, his life would have been immensely worse. And he also could have just asked for money. Jesus was popular. He could have said, "Take up a collection. I'll make more money today than I made in 5 years." He could have said, "These people are picking on me. Can you please tell them to stop?" But he had an idea of what his deepest need was. And that's a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves, because Jesus is asking us that. What do you want me to do for you? As an individual, as a parent, what do you want me to do in the life of your child? What is it that you want? And the answer to that says a lot about who we are and how we view Jesus. I want to touch on one other passage, the pool at Bethesda, in John chapter 5. This is one of my favorite passages. These are two of my favorite passages in the Bible. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades, and these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. The part I want to focus on, Jesus asked him a really interesting question. Do you want to be healed? Did he answer that question? No. It's a yes or no answer. Do you want to be healed? How did he answer it? I can't get to the pool. Somebody always gets there before me. So at some point in those 38 years, and by the way, some of you are not even 38 years old in this room. Those of us who are older than 38, there are things in our lives, and I'm going to go through a couple, where we go, these things become synonymous in our heart and our mind with what it means to lead a healthy life. So for him, at some point during those 38 years, and he had spent so much time there, he could not think of the word healing without thinking of that pool. He could not conceive that healing could be possible in another way. And that's what Jesus was trying to tell him. But we're the same. We say to ourselves, I would be happy, I would feel loved, I would have purpose if they finally gave me that promotion that I'm due. If I could only make the lacrosse team. If I could only get into the right school. And these get harder. If I could only get married. If I could only have children. And I know as we're talking about parenting, I'm talking to a group where I'm sure there are people in this room who have never had children, have lost children. Right? And there is a pain that is connected to that. And I want you to know that I see that. And it has to be even hard to sometimes even sit in a group where we're talking about these things, and these are the desires of your heart. Then it goes on in the future, like, we all wanted to have children. I'd be happy if my children would just behave, right? And then later in life, we go, I would be happy if my child would leave the house, right? If they would finally move out on their own, I would be happy. And by the way, I'm not saying that these things aren't significant. They are, but they are a means to an end. They're not an end in itself. And just like the man at the pool at Bethesda, we take things that are a means to an end, we make them the end, and then that is what we've determined will make us happy or make us healthy in life. And that's the core issue. And like I said, when Jesus is asking us these questions, right, what does it, what have we gotten fixated on over time that this has to happen for me to have a good life? So I do all these, and we're going to close up in a second. I know there's lots of questions, and I want to answer them. So I do all these meetings with pastors and nonprofit leaders because people come to our office, but I have a friend of mine who runs a church, who's a pastor of a church right across from a hospital. They literally have people that walk out of the psychiatric ward in the hospital and walk into the office at the church. Like, people just walk into your lives when you're in the church. And so I want to hear kind of what they're dealing with in their community. So I was meeting with this with these folks from a Christian school up in North Jersey. And it was at the end of the school year, and we were kind of talking about lessons they've learned and things they struggled with and what they want from the kids. And the principal said, I said, what was your frustration? What would you want? He's like, there's one kid. There's one kid. And he's in my office like 3 times a week. And my hope and wish is that this kid would just get it. And I asked him, well, what does get it mean? Like, he would straighten up and fly right? His behavior would be better. But I had a chance before to have a conversation with the principal privately. Asked him, I ask people questions all the time, like, how did you get into education? Why did you do it? What do you love about it? And he got into it because he loved children and wanted to really be a part of sharing Jesus in their lives and being an example of Christ. And then he also told me about this kid. And this kid, his dad was murdered when he was 2. Grew up in a very difficult environment. And so when he told me that story, I wish the kid would just get it, because I had the context. I said to him, literally, not joking, I'm not trying to be sacrilegious. I said, literally, thank God that this kid has not gotten it. Because if he straightened up and flew right and got better grades he wouldn't be in your office. What does he need more than good grades? He needs a man in his life who is going to show him grace, the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. And because his behavior is atrocious most of the time, he's in your office 3 times. One day I pray and hope that he will look back and go, this man stood in a gap in my life and showed me love when I didn't deserve it. And I always tell people, grace is not linear. The expression in giving of grace is not always received as grace at the time. Right? How many of you guys went back to one of your high school teachers and was like, I was an idiot, right? You were really kind to me, and I was really stupid, and I'm really sorry. Anybody a junior high school teacher? I really feel bad for junior high school teachers, because nobody goes back to their junior high school teacher, right? I call them factory workers of grace, right? You're working with the same kids every year, and you never get anybody to come back and go, man, I really blew it when I was in 7th grade, right? Never happens. Very, very difficult. But when we understand, this is what his purpose was, this is what he wanted to do, I was so thankful that he didn't get it. So, and by the way, before I close up, I just want to share with you guys, and then we'll answer some questions. I'm guilty of the same stuff. My son Jake, he's 22 years old, and I have a doctorate, so obviously on some level I value education, right? My dad was the first person in his family to ever go to college. All of his sons went to college, all got graduate degrees. So when my son dropped out of college after a semester, how do you think I felt? Not great, right? His life is ruined, right? He's never going to amount to anything. This is what I said to him on his birthday. No, I did not say that to him on his birthday. But I was concerned, and because I'm guilty of the same thing. Hey, I want him to do, like I said, there's nothing wrong with saying I want my child to do well in society, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But that was kind of where I was stuck. I'll just fast forward. At the time, my son was really struggling, was kind of nowhere with Jesus. He ended up getting a job at a church. He's working at another church right now. Over the last 6 months, his relationship with Christ has grown dramatically. He has a sense of community and people that love him and he loves. I'm like, I came to a realization, and this is the last thing I want to share with you guys before we delve into some of your questions. God loves Jake infinitely more than I could ever love him. God knew, because it was in my heart somewhere that he'd come to know Jesus, and right, like that was in my heart while I was still praying for him to do really well in baseball and get into a good college. Like God knew that the most consistent prayer of my life for him was for him to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus' grace. And man, God was way more consistent than I was in pursuing that. And I look back now and look at how God has woven those things together in his life. And by the way, it's not a straight line. He may still have problems in life. We all have problems. Life is full of problems. And I'm not saying that, everything turns out the way we want, because ultimately, too, we don't have control over whether our children come to know Jesus. We don't have control over that. All right? But we can, as best we can, put that forward as if Jesus asks us that question, what do you want me to do for you? We can regularly put that forward. And we can regularly be thinking about how are we parenting that's connected to them understanding that. And by the way, we can't get them to understand, we can't get them to come to know Jesus, but we can get them to understand grace and mercy through our lives. Right? And how we love and how we ask for forgiveness and how we say we're sorry, right? Okay? Those are all really important pieces. So I want to close up because I want to make sure we have some time. How much time do we have for questions? We got 2 minutes, right? Longer than that. Okay, we have longer than that. Let me pray and then we'll answer some of your questions, and I'll weave some more of this in. Father God, thank you for this time. Thank you for these folks. Thank you for the questions that they're asking. Thank you for this church and the way that it serves its community and desires to be a light of you in this community. Just be here now as we go through these questions. Help my words to be your words, Lord. And I don't want to speak anything that you wouldn't want me to say. So guide this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Hey, can we just thank Matt?
Thanks.
All right. Wow. All right. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to unpack, and we've got a lot of questions, and so let me just tell you up front, we're not going to get to all of them. I wish we could. However, I've already talked to Matt in between the services. He's willing to come back, spend some more time with us, like on a Wednesday night or Sunday night, and so if we don't get to your question right now, I hope there's going to be more opportunities, and we're going to try to make that happen, all right? So first of all, I just want to say, one of the things I love that you really drive home in this, that's just really near and dear to my heart, is I think when we think about, you talked about with mental health, we think about like as the removal of negative symptoms. Mm-hmm. And I think in the church, like oftentimes, I think of it as like the difference between getting somebody to stop smoking so they don't get lung cancer versus training for a triathlon and really pursuing like this health. It's just it's a completely different type of health, really. Yeah. One is like staying alive, and one is experiencing life. And in the church, I think oftentimes we get wrapped up on just stop smoking. Yeah. Instead of encouraging people to pursue what you were describing today is really who God's created us to be in this fullness of life. Yeah. I think of like the abundant life that Jesus talks about. Yeah. But where I want to start, so anyway, I just really appreciate that. I want to start with some questions that we got earlier. And I'm going to try to kind of bundle some of these together, but one of the questions that comes up is just thinking about, one, there's sort of mental health with like the resilience you were talking about, coping mechanisms, there's sort of that almost behavioral side of mental health, and then there's the reality of like chemical imbalances that sometimes require medication. How do you kind of put those two together? How do you think through that, and how should parents be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think that, just like I said before, there's a cost to doing things, and then there's a cost to not doing those things. And so I'll use the example of ADHD. So there's a cost to people taking medication for it. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't answer your questions specifically about medication. I can say, when I would encourage people to talk to a psychiatrist. And by the way, I would encourage people to talk to a psychiatrist, not their general practitioner. I love my general practitioner. He's fantastic. He sits and talks with me. If I need a pacemaker, he's not the guy. Okay? And if your general practitioner thinks he's the guy to install a pacemaker in your chest, you might need to go see somebody else. So this is a specialty. Psychotropic medication is a specialty, like a cardiologist would be a specialty, right? Like a nephrologist is a specialty. And because psychiatry is kind of an art and a science, like there's a little bit, and that's true in all medication, right? All areas. You want to work with somebody who's an expert in it. I think the cost at times of not taking medication sometimes is worse than the cost of taking it. I'll give one example. I'll use this. I've worked with parents who've said, I don't believe in medication. I don't want my children taking medication. And I go, and again, I don't get a set of steak knives when I get people to go see a psychiatrist. That doesn't happen. But I'm like, well, if you had diabetes, you would take medication. If you had high cholesterol, you would take. When I say what I'm going to say about medication, I think medication has been a huge help in our society, cured or helped lots of diseases. Unfortunately, there's this movement where it's like medication only. However, if you have somebody who is 17 years old and they finally start taking medication for ADHD, that doesn't erase all of those years that they felt stupid, struggled in school, didn't have friends, got in trouble at school. So just because they get medication and it helps them doesn't erase how they already feel about themselves. So, and then the other phrase I use all the time is that with certain situations, things need to be treated before they can be counseled. I do talk therapy, and I think that talk therapy and kind of working through the heart of people's issues is at the core of health. However, because I think it's ultimately a very deep form of discipleship. But there are some times where somebody is so profoundly depressed or so anxious that they can't even engage in a conversation. I'm sure you guys have experienced that, where you want to help somebody, but they are so stuck in a place that they can't even engage in the conversation. They can't benefit from it. In fact, the conversation can make it worse. So there are times where the symptoms need to be treated, right, in order for the problem to be addressed. I'll give you one quick example, and this is something I use with my students all the time. So somebody walks into a hospital room bleeding from a massive head wound that they got while in a drunken stupor they fell and hit their head. Okay, so the alcoholism might be a deeper problem, but if you don't treat the head wound, they're going to die. So we treat the head wound. Then we find out that they're an alcoholic because they're self-medicating for depression. But we got to treat the alcoholism because the alcoholism could also kill them. Then we start to treat the depression. We find they're depressed because they struggle to have relationships. Why do they struggle to have relationships? They struggle to have relationships because their parents abandoned them when they were 6 months old, and they struggle to attach to human beings, like just basic attachment. So you want to, as best you can, the goal is to go to the deepest problem. But sometimes, because I think that has a cascading effect on everything else, but sometimes you have to treat the more emergent problems in order to have the time to be able to treat those deeper issues. That's why in the church, there's always been this struggle between I was raised Catholic. So historically, the Catholic Church did a lot in the world. Like back in 1985, when there was the famine in Ethiopia, it was Catholic charities that were on the ground providing for food. And the Protestant church, this is historically, was more interested in giving them Jesus. We need to do both. And the Catholic Church has gotten better at that, and the Protestant Church has gotten better at that. We need to do both. We need to take care of the physical needs, the more immediate needs, and we also need to do the other. I feel the same thing can happen with medication and psychological issues.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I've got a number of questions kind of in this vein around, this is a little bit general, but maybe we can get a little bit more specific towards the end, is just we live in a world where there is so much, kids are really bombarded. They have access to a lot more online.
Yeah.
Generally, how do you raise mentally healthy children when there is so much out there and there's so much accessible Oftentimes, we're going to talk about this in terms of technology, obviously, with our phones and internet. I guess the question that they're wondering is how do you counsel parents in terms of how their kids are exposed to the world, specifically like with technology, with social media? I don't know, what advice can you give to parents who are just kind of struggling with, when to give a kid a cell phone, even as simply as that?
And I think as parents, I think we struggle with, this is the way that people communicate, right? Is through text message, through their cell phones. And so if we make the decision to say, well, my son is going to be the only senior in high school that doesn't have a cell phone, then in some ways, the unintended consequence of that is we're cutting them off from a social life, which then has its own problems, right? If we cut them off from connection with people. However, the two things I think about with smartphones, one is they've changed, like social media and smartphones have changed. In fact, there is a pretty direct correlation between the increase in depression and anxiety and the introduction of smartphones in our society. Lots of schools are removing smartphones from school, which I've talked to kids who have experienced that, and they actually love it. They're actually engaging with one another. The thing is, two things I would say. One is be aware that your child, and I'm going to be a little provocative here, but be aware that your child is the product. They're not the consumer. When smartphones started, we were the consumers. Now we're the product. All right? So this is the provocative piece. Our children are being trafficked on a daily basis. They're being trafficked on a daily basis. Their information is being sold. Their eyes are being sold. Right? They're the product. The other is, look, every generation, like we always say, oh, nobody reads anymore. Well, when the radio came out, people read less. When the TV came out, we don't want to be the get off my lawn generation, right? We all become the get off my lawn generation. The internet is amazing. It's amazing. Imagine what the internet has done for people in underserved communities and underserved parts of our world, the access to information. So, however, there's a time and a place developmentally. So you realize, like, if your child takes their cell phone into their bedroom at night, you are inviting the world into their bedroom, right? That doesn't sound so smart to me. Now, on the other side, what I'm seeing with college students, and it starts younger, it has to start younger, is the access to information is so great. We used to be able to, as parents, we used to be able to limit what our kids saw, and that was it. They just couldn't see it, right? Now, the reality is we live in an information age. There is so much information. So I've had this conversation at the university with some people where we don't fight, like, there's always this thought that schools indoctrinate kids, like secular colleges, you hear that all the time. And I would say, look, we don't fight one form of indoctrination with another. We need to teach people how to think about the information that they have access to. That's the relational piece of parenting. Our kids, we know when we go on Facebook and we see a picture of people smiling on Thanksgiving, we realize that was the only 30 seconds that they were all sitting together and smiling before they were throwing yams at each other. But our kids don't necessarily know that, and they go, gosh, these people are so much happier than me. They're all so happy, I'm miserable. And they start comparing, and they don't have the context. So we have a lot in society in general is information without context. For those of you, as the adult version of that is going on WebMD and always thinking you have cancer, right? So real quick, I did this experiment with one of my clients. He thought he had cancer, and I said, okay, well, pick a symptom. And he said, well, pain in my big toe. I said, okay, pain in your big toe. And we went on WebMD. And at some point down the list is cancer, right? So any symptom you put in there, so it's information without context is what we're dealing with in society. I always tell people, go talk to a doctor. Have a conversation. And that's the same thing. I think we need to be having more conversation with our kids. Back in the day, for example, we could have, I love my parents. They didn't really have deep conversations with me a lot. And I turned out okay. That is impossible now. Which, by the way, that is great. The cure for what's going on in society is deeper relationship and deeper connection. We can't go back to the 80s and the 70s where it's like, okay, if I can just, my kids, there's only so much trouble they can get into, I don't really need to talk to them all that much. No, you need to have a relationship with them, which I think is fantastic. That's what God has done to heal that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Wow, so the text is like blowing up. So again, not going to be able to get all of these. This is one that came up last week. We didn't get to talk about it.
Okay.
So this is great. I would love for you to speak to this. For those of us who are
James'
parents,
mom is a terrible parent. Is that what the
that's
question
what it was.
Okay.
How rate James on a 1 to 10? No. We're all, for those of us who are parents, we're all inheriting our parenting to
Yes.
some degree from our parents. How do you counsel those, in terms of working through the scars from what you've experienced growing up, and then not passing that along to your kids?
Yeah, I think nobody tells you this when you become a parent. So all love is sacrificial by nature. Love must be sacrificial in order for it to be love. Real love is sacrificial. And as parents, one of the greatest sacrifices that you will ever experience for your children, and not one you want to rub their noses in or even tell them about, is in order to parent differently than how you were parented, requires you to work through those issues of what you experienced, which means you're going to have to feel the pain again. You're going to have to, when you parent your kids differently. I'll tell you a quick story. There was this guy that I worked with, really not a great dad, very uninvolved in his kids' lives, had an epiphany. Didn't entirely change his life, but he had an epiphany. He was sitting in his lazy boy chair while his wife was running around the house, getting the house ready for one of their kids' birthday parties. And he sat there and he said out loud, which he then brought up to me, "I never had a birthday party as a kid." Now, if you're going to experience that pain and make it different, then you got to get up and plan that birthday party. And you got to feel the pain. I should have had this. Right? I should have had this. This was wrong. And that's the love of a parent, is being willing to experience that pain again. Otherwise, we're destined to repeat the same patterns of parenting that we experienced. And by the way, not necessarily for any kind of big psychological reason, although there are some. It's the only form of parenting we know. It's what we experienced. It feels usual. It feels normal. So we do it. In order to be a different parent, you have to purpose to really face those things. And I have so much heart and admiration. There was this guy I worked with who, his father was very cruel to him, but he was a good grandfather. And I said, I get it. I know what it's like to take your kids to his house and feel that pain. And your kids will never know the sacrifice that you've made to go there and let them have a relationship with him, because he wasn't abusive to them. But he had to feel it. That's the pain of being a parent, right? That we go through those things.
That's good. One of the questions that somebody sent, and I'm going to close with this one, is does CCCRD offer a discount for EBC members? And let me just say real quick, no, they do not. I don't have a code I can give you, you can go on. But I will say this, part of who we are as a church is that we're a family, and we care for one another, we support one another. And I don't know how many of you know this, but we have people who give to what we call our benevolence fund. And that is a way that we actually do come alongside people in hard times in their life, and we support them financially in ways that we can. And so if you reach out to us and say, this is what I'm struggling with, and we will walk alongside you. We want to help anybody who needs it to get whatever help that they need to the extent that we're able. And so we love you. We do this regularly for people within the church. And so if you're part of our church, and we'd love to have that conversation. If you're new with us and you're not part of our church, we will still have that conversation with you, because we want to walk alongside you, because we said we want God to change your life. He loves you. He wants to change your life for the better. And this is what we're talking about, is growing in that relationship with him. So, I'm not putting on. You look like you want to say something.
Can I speak into that for 30 seconds?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so certainly we're not the only counseling center around, and we will help people no matter what find help. That being said, and we have different options for people who can't pay the full amount. Remember, I started by saying I'm going to be offensive, so I'm going to remove all goodwill and be offensive again, just briefly. So when it comes to our time and our money, right, that's where our treasure is, that's where our heart is. And our treasure is our time and our money. And so often we have to ask those questions. What do I really value? And a lot of us treat our time especially, and our money, I use this example when it comes to time management. A lot of people treat their time. Anybody like my family, anybody play trash Jenga, all right, with the kitchen trash can? So what we do with the kitchen trash can is, and this is how we handle our time. We just keep pushing it down. Like, we feel like we can just compress enough things that we can create more room if we compress stuff. And then in our family, it's like trash Jenga. Whoever puts the last piece of trash that makes the trash fall, they're the one that has to clean it up and take it out to the trash can. But really, our time and our money, for most of us, is more like a full milk carton. You can't put anything else in it. You're going to have to take something out to create room for this, right? It's like, oh, wow, that's great. Matt's talking about having more relationships, with more conversations with my kids. I doubt that any of you in this room have hours that you're spending staring at a blank wall. Right? You're going to have, that's why I'm saying, asking different, better, harder questions. Like, well, what is it? You've heard the old story, right? If an alien came down and looked at how you lived your life, they told you what you valued based on how you spent your time, it's probably not really the way that you would probably say what you value, yet how we spend our time really is that way. So when it comes to time, money, but by the way, anybody wants to have that kind of conversation 7 days a week, twice on Sundays, I'll have that conversation with you, because that is the core. Like, how we spend our time and how we spend our money really speaks to what we value.
Yeah, somebody really, really wise pointed that out. And yeah, I love that. Again, Matt, thanks so much for being here. Can we just thank Matt one more time? I really appreciate him coming out.